Today we will build a URL shortener application, and it will work just like services like tinyurl, bitly or Genius, for example. We will build the application with Next.js, and we will use Next.js middleware and edge functions together with serverless Redis for storing our links to Redis database. Here are the steps that we will make for this application. So first we will create a form for saving the URLs. So it will have just text input and a button and a list of all the URLs that we have already saved. Then next we will create this API route, API/shorten, and it will be used for generating the short URLs for the long URLs. And next we will create this API route called API/links. And we will use this with a GET request for getting all the links from the Redis database to our front-end code. And last, we will create this /go/ then the short URL as a parameter, this kind of a route. And this is basically the endpoint that we will use with the short URLs. So this endpoint will redirect the user to the correct endpoint based on the given short URL. So these are the features that our application will have that we will create today. So let's go ahead and start with the number one, so the form for saving the URLs. So over here I have a new Next.js project open. So I just created this with yarn create next app. So I haven't done any modifications to this yet. So let's start by going to the pages folder and then opening up the index.js. And over here, I'm just gonna actually remove everything and start from scratch. So we will have our form in the index.js file. So let's create our component for this page. So like this, I just defined a simple component, and let's open up the console and try to run this and just see that everything is working correctly. So I'll type in yarn dev and then open up the localhost page, and we get the front page text over there. I'm gonna also open up my dev tools just to see what's going on in there. But yeah, we have the component working. So now let me just add some code for the text input and then for the button that will trigger the request for creating the short URL. So I'll just add some code for those right now. Okay, so right here I imported the useState from React, then defined this long URL variable with useState. Then I also created a function called onCreate that will be triggered when the create button is clicked. So right here I just added an input with value of long URL, and onChange function sets that long URL. And the button triggers the onClick or the onCreate function that's defined right there. So I'll save it and switch to the browser, and let's see what we get over here. So it looks like we have the input and the button over there. So let me try to type something in here and click make it short. And right here we see in the console the text make this short, and then the text we inputted because we set the onCreate function to just log that message right now. So the next thing we need to do is actually post the long URL inside of this onCreate function. And for this I will use Axios. So let me just quickly install it. And I'll reboot the server. And then over here, let's import it like this. And then inside of here, we want to use Axios to post that URL to our API route. And as we set it over here, we will use this /API/shorten for generating the short URL and saving it. So I will copy that and go over here. And let's type in const result equals await Axios post and then the URL, so the /API/shorten. And as a second parameter, we want to pass in the payload, which in this case will be the long URL like this. And just for now, I'll console log the result. So let's switch to the browser and see if we are making that request. So inside here, if I enter something, click the button in the network tab, we can see that it makes the request to that API shorten URL with the payload that we inputted over here. Okay, great. So next we need to actually make that API route. As we can see, it returned 404, so it's not found. So let's switch to the Visual Studio Code, and inside the API folder, I will create a new file called shorten.js. And let me just define the handler function. So right here, we want to get the URL from the body of the request. And after that, we want to generate a short URL for that. So generate short URL. And after that, let's save it to Redis like this. So this is roughly what this API route will do. So let's start from here. So first, let's get the long URL like this. And then we actually should check that the long URL is actually set. So let me just add that code. So over here, we check that the long URL variable is set and that its length is greater than 0. And if one of those checks is false, then we will return 400 and just an error message. So the execution of this API route will end over here on the line 6. But if the URL is set, the next thing we want to do is to generate the short URL. So let's do that. So I define the short URL with this function, and we still need to define this function. So let's add that function over here like this. And I'm not gonna pretend that I wrote this myself. To be honest, I copied it from Stack Overflow, just Googled that, make random characters with JavaScript, and this is what came up. And here as a parameter, you can define the length of that string. And for us, we will use 4 characters. So this right here should now return random string to this variable. And now the last part of this is that we want to save the short URL right here together with the long URL to the Redis database. So we can later on, when we are going to that number 4, to the Go endpoint, we can actually find that long URL based on that short URL. So in order to save it to Redis, we need to first go to the browser and open up upstash.com. So with Upstash, we can host our Redis database, and it's actually using serverless Redis to do that. And if you scroll down a little bit, right here we can see that it's designed for the edge. So Upstash has this REST API for accessing and interacting with the Redis database, which is really great because we are using this from our API routes that will be converted to serverless functions once they are deployed to Vercel. So this is great for our use case. And which is also good is that they offer this free tier that you can get started with. And once you need more databases, you can upgrade to the pay-as-you-go plan. So let's go back up here and click the console. and you will be prompted up with the login or sign up form. So if you don't have yet an account, you can create one for free. For me, I already have one, so I will just log into that. Okay, now I'm logged in, and the plan here is actually to create a Redis database inside Upstash, then get the connection information for that database and add it to our code so our code can interact with the Redis database. So once you are logged in, go to the Redis tab up here and then click Create Database, and you can give it a name. And I'll select the region over here and then just click Create. Okay, great. We have our database created. And on the details page, let's scroll down a little bit and you can see this REST API section. Click on the Upstash/Redis. And what this Upstash/Redis is, it is actually an NPM package that Upstash provides for interacting with their REST API. So as we can see, we could interact with the REST API with curl or JavaScript fetch, for example, just calling the API like this. But with this NPM package, it's much easier, in my opinion, and clearer to actually use that REST API because you get this Redis client out of it and you can call functions on that client that are easier to understand and read when you are looking at the code. So we will use this NPM package and you should see the code down here. So I'll click up here, copy, and then go back to the Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to make a new file, or actually a new folder first, to the root level over here and call it lib. And inside of the lib folder, I'll create redis.js file. So this file will be imported anywhere in the application that we need to use Redis. So that's the function of this file. So I'll paste in the code I copied from the Upstash, and everything here is already set up for your database. So you have your own token and own database URL up here. So you don't have to change any of those when you copy it from Upstash. And instead of using it like this, we will actually just export default Redis like this. And actually, let's not export it as default. I'm just gonna export it and I'll add it over here like this. Let's save it. And now we can use this Redis client to interact with the Redis database. So I'll switch back to the API route, the shorten.js API route. And we left over here to the save it to Redis part. So first I'll import that Redis client up here. Like that. And then go down here. So let's first define a variable, and it equals wait because all these function calls are asynchronous, and we will use that Redis client and the hset function of it, and the first parameter will be the name of the hash. So this hset function will push stuff to a hash inside of the Redis database. And the hash is kind of a JSON object, and it's a good way to store the links in our case because we will store them like the short URL will be the key of the object, and then the object value will be the long URL. So let me just type it out so you can see it how it looks, and I think it's easier to understand that way than me just explaining it. So this is the name of the hash. We will call it links. And then we will push to that links hash an object with the key of the short URL, and it will equal to long URL like this. And after that's created, we can return the 200 and then a JSON message saying like status success. and save it. So now we should have an endpoint that generates a short URL, and then using the Redis client from the Upstash Redis package, we will set that value to the hash named links, and the value will be short URL as key and then long URL as the value. And if this doesn't make sense yet, let's just try it out, and I will show you the data, and maybe that way you will get a better understanding how it works. So I'll save this file, and I have my server running, and I'll switch to the browser and then go to the front page of our app, and I'll just refresh this. So now let's add over here like www.youtube.com and click make it short. Okay, we get some errors. Let's see. Oh yeah, I see we forgot to install that npm package. So let's switch back to the VS Code and let's just add that. Okay, now the Upstash Redis package is installed. So let's start our server and switch back to the browser and refresh the page. Now let's try youtube.com, make it short. We can see it makes the API request to the API route with the correct payload, and it actually returns 200. So looks like it's working, but now let's go to the Upstash, and inside Upstash we have this data browser tab, which I found very useful, because with this you can browse your Redis database based on different data types. So right here I will click the hash because we stored it inside of a hash, and we can see we have a hash called links, and then inside of that hash we have a JSON object which has the key as the short URL. So this is the URL that we generated, and over here is the original, the long URL. So what happens if we add another one? Let's say like this, make it short. Let's go to the Upstash, refresh it. We can see we have added the new URL over here, and it has a unique key, unique short URL over here. So it will just push that new value inside of that hash. So looks like everything is working when creating the URL. So next, let's check our list. So now we have some of the form working. Then we have created this endpoint that shortens the URL and saves it to Redis. So next, let's add this links endpoint for getting all the data from the Redis database, because we don't always want to come here and see the values, but instead we want to display them over here. So let's switch to the Visual Studio Code, and I'll add a new file to the API folder called links.js, and let's add the default handler over here. So inside of here we want to get all the links from Redis and then return them as JSON. So for that we will need that Redis client, so let's import that like this, and then let's fetch those links from the Redis. So I'll define a variable called links, and it equals, and then await Redis dot, and the command for getting all the values of a hash is called hgetAll. So hash get all. And as a parameter, we want to pass in the name of the hash we want to fetch, which in our case is links, like this. And actually, in case our links hash is empty, we should just return empty array, because I think this returns null and we don't want that. So let's just add this over here. So now what this means is that if this returns null, then actually set the links value as an empty array. So I'll save that, and I have prettier installed, and that's the one that's doing these formattings. So it added these parentheses around the await keyword, which is okay. But yeah, so now we are fetching the links to that variable, and next let's just return those links. So res.status first is 200, and then JSON, and that will be the links. Now I think this should actually do it. It shouldn't be more than that. So let's try it out. So I'll switch to the index file, and let's create a new function over here called getLinks. And inside of here, we want to make a request to that API endpoint we just made. So let's do that like this. And then we want to return that response or the actual links. And for that, we can access the links from the response.data.links like this. And I'll actually add question marks over here, just in case for some reason these aren't defined. Okay, so that's our getLinks function. And to test it out, let's for now just make it so that when the page is loaded, this getLinks is called. So I will add a use effect, and we need to first import that like this. And then let's define that use effect hook and call that getLinks function inside of it like this. And let's add the empty array so that it will be run for the first time when the page is opened. And I'll save this. So now the getLinks function is called every time the page opens, and we just log the value. And as said, this is just for testing, and this is probably not something we will do once the application is finished, but let's see if it works. So I'll switch to the browser and refresh the page, and right away we can see that it creates the API request, and the return is the two links that we have inside of Upstash over here. And we can see them on the console also. So looks like our links API route is working. So the thing left to do is to actually display these results over here in the page. So let's do that next. So I'll go to the index file, and for displaying the results, I will add actually a new variable over here where we will store those links. I will call it links like this, and it's an empty object as default. And then I will create a new function actually called refresh links. And what this function will do, it will just fetch the new links from the API and then set them to the links variable up here. So first let's fetch the links. So const link objects equals await, and we can now use this getLinks function. And then let's just set links as links objects like this, and let's rename it to link objects like this. And we will use this refresh links function in a couple of places, so that's why we are doing it this way. You will see it in a minute why it's like this. So now we can actually modify our use effect hook to just await refresh links. So now instead of calling the load links, we will just call the refresh links, and that will load the new links and set them to that links state variable. So now we are fetching the links on the page load. So the only thing left to do is actually display them, and let's do it over here. So I will add the code for the table, and I was thinking about using table for displaying the data, and I will just type it in and let's go through it after that together. Okay, so what I added was this table over here. And inside of the t head, we have two cells, the short URL and the original URL. And inside the body of the table, we are mapping through the keys of the object, the JSON object. And over here, as we saw, the key is the short URL and the value for that is the long URL. So over here, we get the long URL by accessing the links object with the short key. And over here, we are, for the first cell, displaying the short URL. And I just added the short URL because it's a bunch of characters. I added this localhost 3000/go/ and then the short URL. This part over here, this localhost could be defined in like environment variable or something like that. But for this example, I just hard-coded it over there. And then for the second cell, we are just displaying the original, the long URL. And here I also added this on-click handler for the first cell, so the short URL. And if we scroll up a little bit, it's defined over here. So what this on-short URL click function does, it just copies the URL to your clipboard. So you can just click the link and it will be copied right away. I will show you right now. But yeah, that's what I added over here. So let's save it, switch to the browser, refresh the page. And over here we can see the table and we have the two values inside of it. So the short URL and the original URL. So this is the short URL. And now the click handler I was talking about, if we click over here, it will say copy to clipboard. And if I paste it over here, we can see that it's the URL or the short URL that I clicked on. So that's pretty handy. So you can easily share that URL wherever you want. So let's refresh the page. So now we have the basic functionality for this form ready. And if we look at our list, there is still this number 4 that we need to do. But before that, because as we see, this is pretty rough looking. So let's just add some styling to it so it makes a little bit nicer. And then move on to the fourth or the number 4. So I will add some styles over here and then go through it with you together. Okay, so I added some styles. So if we scroll all the way up, I added just this styles variable. And inside of it, we have styles for the h1, container, text input, save button, table, table header, and table short URL cell. And down here, I used those styles like this. So right here is the container. So I added the container style for it. For the h1, I added the h1 style. Then for the input, I added the text input style, and button has the save button style, and the table has the table style, and the table header has the table header style. Bear with me. And then lastly, I added this table short URL cell style for that short URL. And basically what it adds is this pointer cursor when we are hovering over that link. But overall, here is what the page now looks like. So we added a little bit padding for and font size for this input, make the button a little bit bigger, and then add some formatting for the table so they are nicely aligned over there. Okay, so now our form is looking much better. So let's jump into the fourth point, which was making this Go short URL endpoint. And for this, let's go to the pages folder and add a new file into it. Or actually, we need to add a new folder into it called Go. And inside of this, let's add a new file called index.js. And what we will actually do is to handle that redirection with the Next.js middleware. So that way we can intercept that request before it goes to the index.js. And the middleware will also be deployed as edge function, so the redirection will be much faster for users around the world. If you're not familiar with edge functions, I have a couple of videos on those, so you should definitely check those out to learn more. I'll leave a link to the description for those, so you can check them out. But for now, let's leave this index.js just empty over here and add a new file to that Go folder called _middleware, like this. So this file will handle the redirection of the requests based on that short URL. So let's start by adding the middleware handler like this. Then what we first want to do is get the short URL from the request or from the URL. And once we have that short URL known, so that's the 4 characters string, what we will do is to load the corresponding original URL, the long URL for that short URL. So let's load long URL from Redis for short URL, like this. After this, redirect to the URL. And we will add some error handling over here, but this is the rough plan for this middleware. So first, let's get the short URL from the request, like this. So we will first get the path name from the request.nextURL. And the path name is basically the /go/something. And then we will define it to parts. So this will be an array of all those path names divided with the slash. And as we know, the short URL is at the end of the URL or the path name. So right here, we get the last item in that parts array and return that to the short URL variable. So this way we can save the short URL to this variable over here. So next we can start to load that original or the long URL for this variable. So for that we will need Redis. So I'll import that like this, and then let's load it. Const long URL equals, and again it's an asynchronous function, so await and Redis. And how we can get a value from a hash for a given key is with hget function, and the first parameter is the hash name, so links, and the second parameter is the key that we want to get the value for. And in our case, now it's the short URL, like this. So now we should have the long URL saved over there. So let's save it and let's just test it out. Console log this long URL just to see that everything is working correctly. So I'll save this and let's go to the front page and refresh it. So if I click over here, the tuomokankaanpää.com, and paste it in over here. Once I open this, it should now console log that tuomokankaanpää.com inside our console. So let's open that up, and it's okay. We still haven't defined the redirection, so it returns 404. But if we go to the Visual Studio Code, we can see it's logging the long URL inside of here, so for the short URL. So it's working, it's loading the original long URL correctly from Redis. So I'll just go to the front page and let's continue in here. So next we want to check if the long URL is set. So if we found a URL for the given short URL, so let's do that. So right here, the short URL found, and else short URL not found. And if it's not found, we should probably just redirect the user to the front page. And we can do it like this. So return and then use something called next response dot redirect and then pass in the URL we want to redirect this user to. And we can get the root URL from the rig.nexturl.origin like this. And looks like VS Code already imported that next response up here, so that's good. So now let's add the redirection for the case when the URL was found. So before we redirect, we actually also want to make sure that the URL has HTTP or HTTPS in front of it, because this next response redirect requires the URL to have HTTP or HTTPS in front of it. And in our case, for example, we just typed in www.something, so these wouldn't work. So let's create a new variable called valid URL, and let's just call a function called get valid URL and then pass in the long URL like this. And we need to define this get valid URL. So I will paste in some code and explain it. So right here we have the function defined. So we check if the link has the HTTP or HTTPS in it, and if it does, then just return that link. But if it doesn't, let's add HTTPS in front of it. So now we have a URL that has HTTP or HTTPS in front of it in this valid URL variable. So only thing left to do is to redirect the user to this URL. And as we saw over here, we can do it with the next response. So return next response dot redirect and pass in the valid URL like this. So let's save this, and I think this should work now. So let's try it out. So I'll open the browser. So I will click this first link over here. So it is copied to my clipboard, and I go to the address bar and paste it in. So it's localhost 3000/go/ then the string over here. And let's click enter, and it should now redirect us to this tuomokankaanpää.com web page. And voila, looks like it does. Let's try to add one more. So let's add google.com, make it short. And the request went through and it's success, but looks like our list wasn't updated. So let's still add that to our form. So I'll switch to the Visual Studio Code and to the index. And what we want to do is actually inside of the on create. So when we create the new short link, we want to refresh the links like this. So this is just calling this function over here that loads the new links and sets them to state. So it's the same one we use in the use effect over here. So that's good. So we want to refresh the links, and also let's set the link, or what was it? It was the long URL. So we want to set the long URL as empty string, so the input will be emptied once a link is created. So let's switch to the browser, reload the page, and looks like our Google link is over there already. That's good. So let's try to add a new link. So I'll go youtube.com/tuomokankaanpää. So that's my own channel. So let's click make short. Looks like the text input is emptied and we get the new link over here because it automatically refreshed the link. So that's great. So let's try to click this one over here, and I'll paste it into the address bar and go to that URL, and looks like it's redirecting us to the channel page as expected. So that's great. And while we're at it, you might want to click the subscribe button below. If you like this content, it would really help out the channel and show me that these videos are appreciated. So hit the subscribe button if you are not already, and also click the link button below the video if this kind of content is something that you enjoy. So looks like the URL redirection is working correctly, and that was the last thing we designed to do for the application. But actually there is still one thing that I would do for this kind of application. And before I tell that, I just want to say thank you to Upstash for sponsoring this video. So if you haven't already made an account and tested it out, go to upstash.com to sign up for Upstash and use their free tier, for example, to test out the Redis database and how it works with Next.js app like this. And I recommend that you actually follow along and code this application yourself. That's the best way to actually learn all these things. So the last thing I would add for this kind of application is some kind of logging. Because as with any application, believe it or not, logging is actually one of the most important features of an application. And it might not be the coolest one, but if I have learned something in my days in software development, it is that logging will eventually save your butt when you need to, for example, debug a complex issue. To learn how to add middleware powered logging to this kind of Next.js application, watch this video over here next.